Hi, everybody. Welcome to Secure the Seat Live. My name is Minda Hart, and I'm so happy that you're here with us for lunch. You know how we do it every Monday at noon. I have a new guest, and we talk about all the things that make the workplace better than we found them. Today, I am fangirling out. I'm really excited about today's guest, Dr. Pamela Newkirk. She is an author. She is a journalist. She is faculty. She is all the things. And so I'm excited for you to put your information. I know some of you are watching us on YouTube and some are watching us on LinkedIn. So please put your questions in the chat box so that we can get to them throughout our conversation. Welcome, Dr. Newkirk. How are you?
Thank you so much. And I'm fangirling right back at you.
Honored, honored. For those who may not be familiar with your work, would you please tell everybody a little bit more about you?
Yeah, well, I have spent the past 30 plus years, both in journalism and academia, looking at mainly portrayals of African Americans and how those depictions, those prevalent depictions, impact our lives. And so I've written a number of books that in different ways examines the impact of portrayals on African American life. And my latest book, as you know, Diversity Inc., The Failed Promise of a $1 billion Business, kind of took me back to something that I examined early in my career, at least on the faculty at NYU, and that's looking at the quest to diversify the workplace, right? So my first book looked at the uphill battle of African American journalists in newsrooms and kind of looked at why that has not made the kind of impact that many of us had hoped we would have made, looking at the all of the roadblocks to really telling authentic stories about African American life. And it goes back to the embedded ideology around race and around African Americans that sort of has gotten in the way of being able to actually tell the truth. Because for many, the fiction of African American life is far more believable than the reality. The multidimensionality of Black life is not really appreciated in a way that people believe it when they see it. And so they've sort of rested on these familiar patterns of stereotyping, of demeaning. And so that takes on so many different dimensions, which is why in all of my books, I have kind of approached it in one way or the other. The book before this one, Spectacle, The Astonishing Life of Oda Benga, looked at this young African from the Congo who in 1906 was exhibited in the Bronx Zoo Monkey House. And I wanted to look at how that was able to happen during the so-called progressive era in a world-class city, in the 20th century. And so all of it goes back to this embedded ideology. And this ideology comes not from the ground up, but it was taught in places like Harvard and Princeton and Yale and Columbia. And we have never really sufficiently addressed the myriad ways that embedded ideology has perverted not just our national ideals, but it's the air we breathe. We see it in iconography. We see it in television commercials. We see it in music. We see it everywhere, and we're just beginning now to see it addressed in a meaningful way, like beyond the Confederate statues coming down. We're beginning to look at how this toxic ecosystem around African American identity needs to be dismantled, right? So that took me to Diversity Inc., looking at the failed promise of this multi-billion-dollar industry that has failed to result in true diversity in the workplace.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I've loved your work for so many years, and I had read your past books, and then when Diversity Inc. came out, I thought, oh my God, this is exactly what we all need. This is what corporate America needs to really focus in on. And I want to kind of talk about Diversity Inc. for a second. What inspired you to write that book, and what What has surprised you since it's been out in the world about it?
So when I wrote it, it was really out of a frustration of hearing the same conversations that I've heard throughout my career, both in the newsroom and then in academia. I've been a professor at NYU for 25 years. Before that, I worked in daily journalism for 10 years. So we're talking about, 35 plus years that I have heard the exact same conversation around diversity, all the hand wringing, all of the, oh, we have to do this, the rhetoric, the diversity training and the climate surveys and all of that. And we're seeing the apparatus of diversity exploding, especially in corporate America, but also in academia. We're seeing, chief diversity officers coming on board, and we're seeing all the surveys, and we're seeing all of this like busy work around diversity. But what we're not seeing is the needle move.
Right.
Across fields, and the needle has barely budged. And first I looked at, academia and journalism. It hasn't changed there. But what surprised me is that it hasn't changed much anywhere. Whether we're looking at fashion or we're looking at corporate America, the number of Black CEOs has actually gone down in recent years. So that surprised me, that it was far worse when looking across fields than I even imagined when I began to write this book. I had to keep like checking myself. It's like, are these figures true? Like, is it really this bad? So I was surprised. It was a reality check, even for someone like me who knew or suspected that we were not making the progress that the rhetoric suggested. It's far worse than I could have imagined.
Yeah, that it's interesting. Even for me, new kind of in this field, I've recently started to meet people, to your point, who've been in diversity field for over 35 years. And I'm like, that's interesting. And many of them will say the same thing as you said. We're pretty much talking about the same things, right? Oh, we can't find where they are, and all of these different narratives that are perpetuated out there. And I have to ask you this, though. I'm sure you talk at a lot of companies and organizations. And one of the things that I'm finding in my conversations when I'm giving talks is this diversity fatigue, right? That some leaders, they're tired of talking about it. They're done with it. We've checked the boxes. We've done the 90-minute Zoom sessions on anti-racism. What advice do you give to companies and organizations to counter this diversity fatigue?
Right, because we heard about diversity fatigue in the 90s as well. So again, it's this pattern. It's like, we'll talk about it, talk about it, talk about it. Nothing will change, and then we'll stop, and we've done it already. Like, we've had the conversation, like there's nothing else. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to interrogate the tension between all of the rhetoric around diversity, all of the billions of dollars that have been spent on it, and the lack of diversity. And so I wanted to look at what has been done. Like, why has there been this systemic failure to move the needle despite all of the good people? There are many good people who have come into that field, and you've had some of them on your program, who have been in there, who have fought the good fight, and yet there's this stubborn resistance to change. So I wanted to look at both what has been done, what the patterns are that have failed, and what has been done successfully. What can we do to disrupt this pattern that we just seem so like just wedded to? And so that's why I wanted to say, okay, I want to write this book so I never have to talk about diversity again. Right? I want to get it all out on the table, investigate it. Here it is. Now stop it. Now just stop with the nonsense. Like, this is what worked. This is what didn't. Why are you continuing to do what doesn't work? It doesn't work. We've had now 50 years of experimenting. And,
Yeah.
the results are in. And yet many companies and all kinds of institutions continue to do the exact same thing and expect different results. So that's why I wrote the book, just to like, so we can like at least move past this tired conversation about diversity to what we can do differently.
Yep, absolutely. Because it's tired. I'm tired of
Oh,
it too.
you know, and 10 years from now, if we continue to do the same thing, we're going to have the same tired conversation 10 years hence. And so that's why I wanted to look at it now to kind of like just nip it in the bud. Let's stop it.
Yes. And if you haven't read Diversity Inc., make sure that you pick that up. It's wherever you like to buy your books. So make sure that you do that and give that to your leadership as well. You don't have to be a diversity officer to participate in moving the needle forward. We have a couple questions, Dr. Newkirk, that I want to take, and then we'll jump back into our conversation. But we have some audience questions here that says, how do you I'm paraphrasing because it's kind of a long question, but how do you stop from doing the busy work? Like how can you have those conversations with your team?
Yeah. So one thing, you know, the lack of diversity is a leadership problem. This The buck has to stop at leadership. I think what's happening is chief diversity officers and others who work in the mind of diversity are kind of like left, like kind of marginalized within most of these institutions. And if it doesn't work, well, it's them. But like no, this is a top down problem. And so if you don't have buy-in from the leadership, I can give you a million strategies that have borne fruit, but none of them are going to work in institutions for which this is not a priority. So that's number one. So, that's why there's such a high turnover of diversity officers, because they keep going into these places and they hit this wall because they see that there's really not the buy-in. Oftentimes they're seen as sort of like, window dressers, that they're there so that the company could say, see, we hired this person, we care about this, we're paying them good money, but yet they don't really have the resources, they don't really have the support of those institutions. In fact, there was a study, a survey last year by Russell Reynolds of Fortune 500 CDOs, and they found that only 35% even had access to the metrics in their companies that would allow them to actually see where the problems lie. And so if you have the majority of your CDOs without the basic, tools to do their work, you cannot expect success. So how do you have those conversations? I think to be a chief diversity officer takes a degree of courage. If you're not like a particularly courageous person, it's probably not the line of work you should be in, because it does require someone who sees themselves as a change agent, because you're there to kind of disrupt. You are a disruptive force within that organization, but the organization has to want you there to fix what's broken. And
Yep.
and so those two things have to work together, or the whole thing, it's not going to work.
Yeah, I mean, you are preaching right now. This is so true. I see the chat. They're flaring up. They're like, yes, yes, to everything that you're saying. That you're saying. Church fans are going wild. I see it. We have another question for you. Is it possible for the news biz, with its own diversity problems, to accurately cover D&I in the corporate world? That's a good question.
Is it possible? My first book, why it's so difficult to tell these stories in the newsroom, because many times you're looking at the newsroom is a microcosm for the larger problems we see in society, right? And so you do step on a lot of toes when you tell these stories. I mean, I stepped on toes when I wrote my first book. I'm in a journalism department where many of these people come out of the newsroom, and I'm stepping on toes because I'm writing about things that they recognize to be true, but that are uncomfortable truths, right? And
Yep.
so It's amazing. I got tenure actually. Like,
Congratulations.
yeah. So these kind of issues are not particularly welcomed in the newsroom. Oftentimes, there are exceptions, and I'll tell you. You asked early in the conversation what has surprised me since the book came out. And I think one of the things that has surprised me is the extent to which more um, newsrooms are willing to have these hard conversations. And I think that's directly a result of the mass movement around Black Lives Matter, particularly after the killing of George Floyd. I think more people, and I'll say more white Americans in particular, are more willing to lean into this because remember, until like maybe a year ago, we were post race, or maybe after Trump was elected, more people realized we weren't post race.
Yeah.
But certainly since the killing of George Floyd, no one can claim ignorance. There's there's been a loss of innocence. If you didn't believe that there was systemic injustice around race in this country, I don't think you have nowhere to hide now. It's all out in the open. And so I think that may make it easier. And I'm not saying easy, it's still a difficult conversation to have in the newsroom or in any other environment where they're usually homogenous spaces, right?
Mhm.
And another problem for chief diversity officers is they're usually coming from marginalized communities. And then they're going into these homogenous environments where they're further marginalized. Oftentimes, they are the executives of
Yep.
color in those organizations. And to have to continue to like go against these structures, it's like it's a very difficult position to be in.
Yep. Thank you for that question, and thank you for your answer. The next question that I have for you is, recently there's been, speaking of the administration, recently there's been an executive order to try and eliminate diversity training as it relates to race and white privilege. Can you talk about how this could potentially affect the corporate structure of diversity, equity, inclusion?
Yeah, well, a few weeks ago, many corporate leaders uh, requested that Trump rescind that order because it's already having a chilling effect in the workplace, that people are afraid of the consequences of pursuing any kind of diversity measures. But this is part of the pattern, Menda. It's like in the 1960s, there was national buy-in to finally folding African Americans into the main of American life, right? And after the urban unrest, and we had the Kerner Commission report that found systemic racism that was responsible for issues of housing discrimination, education disparities, and so on. We finally said as a country, we will address this. And we had affirmative action, and we had all kind of measures that began to dismantle some of the structural, causes of inequality. And as soon as this began to flower, what did we have? A backlash in the form of first, the Alan Baki, who sued when he was denied admission to a medical school. He said it's
Mhm.
affirmative action. And so we have all of these cases of alleging reverse discrimination, right? And so all of the gains that were made between the late 60s and throughout the 70s, when we began to close the gap between blacks and whites in educational attainment and poverty and income, and all of these inequalities were beginning to close. And then the backlash happened, and all of the gains that were made throughout the 70s by the 80s were wiped away,
Yeah.
erased. And so there's been this dance of two steps forward, three steps back throughout
Wow.
time. We could see it in Reconstruction. We had finally African Americans being elected as governors and to Congress, and then boom, we had the backlash, the Ku Klux Klan, the Black Codes. So this is a pattern that we've consistently seen. Anytime there's progress made, there are these efforts to roll it back. So this is just another time that we're looking at a way for, a white backlash to Black progress. It's really nothing new, and it's something that we pretty much should expect.
Yes, and that leads me I to say, if you are, I hope you will vote this year, because if you're worried about some of those things, it's very important that you remember that your voice is your vote. So make sure that you make that happen if you haven't already. But thank you, Dr. Newkirk, for that. And we're entering into our bonus questions. I could just sit and listen to you. I'm like this all day. Sit and listen to you. But I am a lover of grits and rap lyrics, and every guest of mine, I first have to ask, is it sugar or salt
Oh,
for
sugar.
your grits? Okay, sugar. Okay, all right.
For my grits?
Yeah, for your grits.
Oh, no, salt for sure.
So, okay, good. Okay. I
I'm
almost,
like I'm a more sweet than savory. No, grits, salt.
so, okay, good. I knew you were a keeper. I knew it. I knew it. And so the other question is, I asked my guests, what is your favorite rap lyric and why?
Well, there's one that's really relevant right now, but Biggie's probably always relevant. But if you don't know now, you know. So to all the people who thought we were post-race,
If you don't know, now you know. That works really well with some, even it is what it is, right? So Biggie is always good any day of the week, but Monday for lunch, I'm definitely feeling that. Thank you for that. And my last question, if you have any questions that you want to ask Dr. Newkirk, please put it in the chat. We'll have time for one more. But my last question for you is, all of us here on the line, we are leaders no matter what. You don't have to have a title to lead, in my opinion, but as leaders in their various fields, what is one tip you would give them on how to make the workplace better than we found it?
Yeah, well, if you are in the CDO space and that's your line of work, I would say stop doing what you've been doing unless you've seen progress. So we don't have time to go through this because this is really the basis of my book, but we already know diversity training doesn't work. In fact, I'd be more up in arms about the executive order if I thought that diversity training actually did something to, disrupt inequality. It doesn't. I would say to look more at models that have actually borne fruit, and it's not around training. It's around interventions. Like, how do we begin to intervene in these patterns? And one way is by expanding our outreach to professional organizations of color, looking in places you did not look for talent. That's what we need to begin to do to kind of reimagine how we look for the people who will be our colleagues in the workplace. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Time to disrupt, because to your point earlier, if we keep doing the same things, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 step, we're not going to get there. And so make sure that you pick up a copy of Diversity Inc. When you right now, if you're able to multitask, do it right now. We have one last question. As an ERG leader, my team and I are actively engaged to help keep leadership involved and engaged in Black equity matters. How else can we help them develop a more personal connection to what's going on so they build accountability and ongoing and not focus on themselves?
Yeah, see, it's a problem when we think it's our job in the workplace to change people's behavior. A lot of the problems that we see in the workplace around diversity is due to the lack of diversity. So the only way we can change the comfort level people have, all of those things, you're not going to do it by beating people over the head. You're not going to do it by giving them articles to read. People have to want to change, and most people don't. So what we have to do is look at how can we develop successful models and have the tools and the resources required to get to the place where we have diversity. That's what we need to do. All of this work around changing how people feel about you, whether they like you, whether they like Black people, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. It's wasted energy. We need to put that energy into finding ways to increase racial diversity.
Mic drop. And if you want more of that, you'll pick up Diversity Inc. today, because you'll hear more. You just got a Sam's Club sample of what's in the book, so make sure that you go and do that. Dr. Newkirk, it's such a pleasure having you on Secure the Seat Live. Is there anything else you'd like to tell our audience before we end lunch today?
No, but I'm so honored to be here with you. And I told you not to call me Dr. Newkirk, but you do it anyway. We're doing this a day before the paperback release of Diversity Inc. So thanks to all of you who have already purchased a copy. It helped get it to the paperback edition. So thank you.
Yes, congratulations. And I am so excited that many of you made the time. You could be anywhere on the internet or in your house right now, and you made time to connect with us. Make sure that you share today's broadcast with people in your company. And if you're in a position where you can make sure that people buy books in bulk, this is a great opportunity for you to support the work of Diversity Inc. And we'll see you next Monday at noon for Secure the Seat Live. Thank you, everybody.